Work at the Capitol ends with a walkout.
I'd rather die fighting on my feet any day than fighting on my knees.
And a vow to bring lawmakers back to finish the job.
We will talk about that between now and the special session to see if there were any items that were missed.
This week, we hear from some of the key players in the session.
You're going to vote on these bills. If you lose, you lose. You don't get to go home and cry about it.
What happened and why, and what's next.
Rest assured that we are going to show up and do the business of Texans when the governor calls us back.
Produced from the Capitol in Austin and airing statewide, this is the award-winning State of Texas.
Hi there, thanks for joining us. I'm Wes Rappaport in for Josh Hinkle. The legislative session is over, but lawmakers will have to come back to the Capitol to take on some unfinished business. House Democrats walked out during the final hours of the session. The move blocked a bill to change the state's election laws. That bill was one of Governor Greg Abbott's priority items. He vowed to call a special session to push it through and added a threat to veto funding to pay House lawmakers and their staff members. This week, we're getting insight from the Big Three. I spoke one-on-one with House Speaker Dade Phelan and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. But we start with Governor Greg Abbott. He's the one who will decide when lawmakers come back and what they'll discuss. I asked him about his response to the walkout and the plan ahead.
When you see all the things that were passed, it's a remarkable session. There were legacy-based issues that people have been clamoring for a long time that finally got across the finish line. Things like constitutional carry, which is a big issue among the Republican Party. Making sure that we keep our cities safe, which means addressing cities that try to defund police. We're not going to allow in Texas the type of programs you see in Portland and Seattle and Michigan and New York and things like that. And so other things that we were able to accomplish on top of making sure that we balance the budget with a limited growth, limited to population growth plus inflation. When you consider all the things that were accomplished, it really is pretty amazing.
On guns, you mentioned permitless carry as something that happened this legislative session. Some Texans, particularly in the El Paso region, feel that there have been promises made that were not kept as it relates to the deadly mass shootings in that community. What's your message to those Texans who feel betrayed?
Well, if you look at, there were some bills that were passed. I think one by Senator Cesar Blanco, that was one of the issues that arose out of that shooting. But listen, we're always working to do two things. One is to make sure that Texans have the liberties that are given to them by the United States Constitution, while also doing everything we can to keep our community safe.
Relating to the winter storm, did the state legislature do enough to address the power grid?
I want to make one thing clear to everybody. First, it's horrific that anybody had to go through a winter storm like that. But it's so important for people to understand that as we come out of this session, the power grid is more secure, more robust, and safer than ever before. Let me tick through just a couple items. One is accountability and transparency, both with the Public Utilities Commission as well as with ERCOT. Second is weatherization. We don't call it winterization because we need the grid to work both in the summer and the winter. But with these weatherization programs, man, it's going to make sure that locations that did shut down will not shut down. The next is enforcement. There are now enforcement mechanisms in place for those entities that do not weatherize. Another is capacity. As we sit here west today, Texas has more power generating capacity than we've had ever before. And then you look at communication, that we now have new communication standards among ERCOT and the PUC, as well as across the entire state of Texas, to make sure there will be early warnings sent to the general public to make sure they are aware of what's going to take place.
As it relates to working out differences on key issues, that's something that you wanted lawmakers to do before you called them back for a special session. Will you share what some of those issues are right now that you want lawmakers to iron out before we get to a special?
I know you would love for me to announce on your show right now what those items will be, but I will not do that. However, as I think you may know, there are two items that I've talked about. One is election integrity. The other is bail reform. Quickly, some people may not know what bail reform is. There are some counties in the state of Texas that are releasing on bail, sometimes personal recognizance bonds, people who are dangerous criminals, who either pose a threat or actually are a threat and harm others while they are out on bond. We need to protect public safety by having bail reform that does not release back onto the streets very dangerous criminals. And so those are two items that I've already announced. There'll be more that we will be announcing later.
In terms of timeline, I know we're looking at a fall special session to tackle redistricting and some federal stimulus. Can you explain to me your thought process on the timeline for addressing bail reform, election integrity,
Sure.
possibly other issues?
Sure. Wes, you have to stay tuned.
All right, and in terms of the quantity of special sessions, do you have an idea as to how many we'll see?
We'll announce it when it occurs.
And is anything off the table at this point in terms of bringing lawmakers back?
Yeah, we're not putting anything on the table or off the table other than those items that I mentioned.
Do you believe that social media censorship, taxpayer-funded lobbying, transgender athletes, do you believe those constitute an emergency worthy of a special session?
Well, first, as I think you know, I support legislation on all of those topics, but I'm not going to be announcing now any other items that will be on a potential special session.
Governor Abbott had much more to say, including insight about the pandemic and the crisis on the border. You can find the full interview online now in the Texas Politics section of your station's website. Partisan battles heat up and change the way lawmakers work.
You know, there's always this constant refrain, we don't want to be like Washington. Well, guess what, friends? We're like Washington now.
We dig deeper into growing divisions under the dome. And the divide goes beyond battles between Republicans and Democrats.
Our trains run on time in the Senate. We get our work done. They took 2 days off last week.
I sit down with two of the state's top leaders to talk about the clash between chambers at the Capitol.